on this Monday night, Pakistan's deepening flood disaster. Monster monsoons submerging a third of the country.
This is a humanitarian disaster, Ji, of epic proportions.
The difficult rescues, roads becoming rivers, and pleas for aid. The long wait for government services.
It's really great standing in line for 3 hours.
An update on Ottawa's mission to clear the backlog. The survivor's flag.
And you can see their hope for the future.
Canada's new tribute to residential school students and their families. And now your garden variety discovery. The ancient skeleton unearthed in a backyard.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Farah Nasser.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We begin with a deadly climate catastrophe gripping Pakistan. A third of the country is underwater, and what the government says is the worst flooding the country has ever seen. More than 1,000 people have been killed since mid-June. 33 million people are affected, many of them displaced. And just to put that in context for you, that's more than the populations of BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec combined. These before and after satellite images show the destruction, communities washed away. Pakistan's climate minister says districts are beginning to look like they're part of the ocean, and the disaster is driven by climate change. Pakistan has never seen an unbroken cycle of monsoons quite like this. 8 weeks of nonstop torrential rain. A national emergency has been invoked, and the extreme weather pattern in Pakistan is alarming. It follows some of the highest recorded temperatures across southern Asia. And tonight, Canada has announced it will provide $5 million in aid to Pakistan. Neetu Garcha reports on the unfolding climate disaster, humanitarian response, and the mission to save lives.
A stranded family saved after climbing onto a bed frame strapped onto a pulley system just above the raging waters by volunteers with one of the largest rescue NGOs in the country.
Most welcome, most welcome.
You can see many cases, so how they rescue people from some dangerous places. Sometimes they grab, sometimes they put it on the back.
Just one example of the resourcefulness of rescue teams in nearly impossible conditions.
There is no movement on the trucks, so the road is not totally closed.
This video shows the moment a luxury hotel in Swamp Valley comes crashing down due to the floods. 8 weeks of unrelenting torrential downpours with rivers bursting in all directions have left thousands without shelter and food. More than 3,000 kilometers of road washed away. Pakistan's federal minister of climate change calling the scenes both human-caused and apocalyptic in this interview with Sky News.
Right now, one-third of Pakistan is underwater, and 33 million are affected. Please tell me how that is not catastrophic. That is the size of a small country.
I don't have the words how we can express our feelings. Definitely, our nation is crying at the moment.
This Halifax-based Canadian with family still in Pakistan is trying to raise funds for the rescues and the eventual rebuild. With experts blaming the catastrophe on climate change, Pakistan's foreign minister is hoping for help from financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, with an estimated fallout of at least $4 billion to Pakistan's economy that was already in crisis.
The fact that Pakistan contributes negligible amounts to the overall carbon footprint, but we are devastated by climate disasters such as these time and time again, and we have to adapt within our limited resources and whatever way we can to live in this new environment.
The IMF board will decide this week whether to release $1.2 billion as part of the bailout program Pakistan entered in 2019. Meanwhile, the United States Agency for International Development telling Global News a disaster management specialist has just touched down in Islamabad to assess the impact of the floods and American assistance beyond the $100,000 committed so far. Neetu Garcha, Global News, Washington.
The impacts of climate change are also being felt in Jackson, Mississippi, which is bracing for flooding tonight. Record rainfall has prompted the state's governor to declare a state of emergency, and Jackson's mayor is telling locals to get out now. Mississippi's biggest city has been battered by days of excessive rain. It's caused the Pearl River there to swell to devastating levels. The river is expected to reach its flood peak tonight, 24 hours earlier than forecast. Up to 150 homes are in the path of destruction, and like Pakistan, roads look like rivers. And residents are being told not to underestimate the threat or return home until officials say it's safe to do so. It's not weather, but backlogs have caused lengthy delays at airports and canceled flights, as well as long waits for passports. Back in June, the federal government launched a task force to find ways to fix the problems. Multiple government ministers said today the situation is improving, but still has some way to go. As Ross Lord reports, that assessment is being called into question after a chaotic weekend at Vancouver International Airport, where a shortage of security screeners led to multi-hour lineups and countless missed flights.
It's hardly an objective assessment, but the government's own task force admits what most Canadians already know. Basic services like processing passports are still falling short.
The majority of applications are still received by mail or dropped off at a Regular Service Canada centre, and only 40% of those were issued within the 20-day business standard.
There is some positive news.
There are also fewer passengers that are facing flight cancellations, with 98% of flights being completed, the same as pre-pandemic levels in 2019.
But on any given day, airports are still a source of frustration. At Vancouver International, travel plans were disrupted on Sunday when travelers waited for hours just to go through screening.
You might communicate a little better and take care of the senior citizens. It's really great standing in line for 3 hours.
On top of continuing stress over the pandemic, ongoing delays are giving rise to impatient suggestions.
Well, a new government, someone who is actually reliable.
Playing into the hands of the Conservatives and leadership frontrunner Pierre Poilievre, who also blames the Trudeau government. Unions representing government workers say they tried to warn a big surge in demand was coming. But the government says demand simply increased much faster than services could respond, noting other countries are having similar problems. The government says it has hired more staff this summer, opened new offices, and customized some services.
By no stretch of the imagination out of the woods yet. The focus will continue to be on Canadians and the results they expect and deserve from this or any other government.
As the pursuit of short-term fixes and long-term solutions continues, travelers are forced to make personal sacrifices, like arriving at the airport 6 hours in advance to wait in line.
Honestly, today was really bad.
The slow going continues. Improvements at times impossible to see. Ross Lord, Global News.
A strike by tugboat workers also causing big delays in one of the country's busiest ports. The largest fleet of tugboats serving the port of Vancouver and Victoria now behind picket lines, and that's trapped cruise ships in port, including the Celebrity Eclipse, carrying more than 2,000 passengers bound for Alaska. Its planned Sunday departure was delayed almost 24 hours. The strike expected to quickly have a domino effect on the already challenged supply chain, slowing down ship movements and impacting port operations. It was an aggressive and frightening incident of harassment. In Grande Prairie, Alberta on Friday, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland was approached by a man who hurled abuse and berated her and her staff. The whole incident was caught on camera. And since then, politicians from across the spectrum have condemned the man's behavior. But as our chief political correspondent David Akin reports, incidents like this one have become all too common for politicians of all stripes and at all levels of government.
Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland had just arrived for a meeting with the mayor.
Chrystia, yes. What the are you doing in Alberta? You traitorous. Get the out of this province.
You don't belong here.
Aides and City Hall staff diffused the situation and no one was hurt. But the perpetrator, a man named Elliot McDavid, had clearly planned the confrontation.
Oh my God, we came at the perfect time.
Oh, that was perfect timing.
Video taken by McDavid's accomplice shows their excitement.
Can't believe she walked in just like that.
I know.
There are now some security reviews as to how McDavid did indeed walk in just like that, while politicians from all parties and all levels of government denounced McDavid's actions.
The confrontation at City Hall captured on video does not reflect the welcoming spirit our region is known for.
Alberta Premier Jason Kenney said the harassment was, quote, reprehensible, while the Prime Minister said such threats have no place in Canada.
We need to call this out and take a united stance against it.
The frontrunner in the Conservative leadership race also said such abuse has to end.
Well, it's absolutely unacceptable.
And said his family has received abuse and threats.
My wife has received so much horrific material directly to her social media account that we've had to hire a private security firm to protect our family against all of that abuse. So unfortunately, this is all too common.
Freeland's cabinet colleague Marcy Ian, a former TV journalist, said women and women of color especially see an inordinate amount of threats and abuse that was once exclusively online, but that is now very much in the real world.
What happened to the Deputy Prime Minister was reprehensible, but not surprising. I agree with my colleagues who say we have to take the temperature down, but I will say that the temperature has been decidedly high for people of color, for racialized people, Indigenous people in this country.
Now, if real-world threats are sparked by online content, well, the Trudeau Liberals promised to do something about that. They promised that they would introduce a bill within 100 days of being re-elected. Well, the election was 343 days ago, and there is no sign yet of any legislation being tabled to combat harmful online content. Farah.
David Akin in Ottawa. Thank you, David. It has been more than 6 months since Russia invaded Ukraine. Coming up, what could determine where the war goes from here? Plus, baseball legend Mickey Mantle hits a home run from beyond the grave. Ukraine's military says its long-awaited counteroffensive in the country's south has now begun. The goal is to recapture the key city of Kherson and the surrounding region, which was occupied by Russian forces back in March. At the same time, an international team of inspectors is now on the way to Europe's largest nuclear plant, which had been repeatedly hit by rocket and artillery strikes. Redmond Shannon has the latest.
Handing out iodine tablets in the city of Zaporizhia, offering some protection in the event of a radiation leak from Europe's largest nuclear power plant 55 kilometres away. A team of International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors has now arrived in Ukraine en route to the nuclear site occupied by Russian soldiers since March.
This is an extremely unusual event. I don't think there's been anything quite like it in history.
Nuclear engineer Robert Kelly led similar inspection missions in Iraq in the 1990s.
We were in a position to go in with the might of the coalition behind us. In this case, they're going in as guests, I believe, of the Russians, maybe the Russians and Ukrainians. And I think that they might very well be prohibited from doing everything that they want to do.
Both sides in the war are accusing the other of shelling the plant. New independent satellite images appear to show a hole in the roof of a building perilously close to a reactor, 100 meters away. Russia publishing these photos blaming Ukraine. Experts say the risk of any meltdown event is low and limited to about 40 kilometers around the plant. But nearby, concerns still remain high. The nuclear inspection mission to Zaporizhia begins as Ukraine announces the start of its long-awaited counteroffensive in the south, including in the neighbouring Kherson region. After months of near stalemate, analysts believe this push using weapons from the west could determine where the war goes next.
If Ukraine is able to liberate Kherson, that will be very important to the overall war effort. If Russia is able to hold on to the city and the region, it could act as a gateway for a future Russian offensive to try to take the key city of Odessa, which could effectively cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea.
Meanwhile, the British Ministry of Defence says Vladimir Putin is now bypassing his Minister of Defence, Sergei Shoigu, and dealing directly with commanders. If true, a further sign Russia's invasion is not going to plan. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Baghdad is under a curfew after supporters of a powerful cleric stormed the city's green zone and government palace. That after Muqtada al-Sadr announced he was quitting politics, frustrated with a stalemate over forming a new government. At least 2 people have been killed in the violence, with dozens of others hurt. Sadr was the biggest winner in October's election in Iraq, but withdrew all his lawmakers from parliament in June after failing to form a government that excluded his rivals. Houston, we have a problem ahead. Why NASA's road back to the moon has hit a huge speed bump. A bit of a letdown for hundreds of thousands of stargazers who either woke up early or camped out to watch NASA's Artemis 1 rocket blasting off into space. The launch in Florida was scrubbed after multiple problems. Artemis 1 is an unmanned mission to the moon, and it's supposed to be the first step for NASA's return to the lunar surface, and is hoped to fuel a giant leap to Mars. Our Mike Armstrong was monitoring the countdown this morning from the Canadian Space Agency in Saint-Hubert, Quebec.
The biggest rocket ever built was on the launch pad and ready to go. It had also drawn hundreds of thousands of spectators out in the early hours to watch the show. While the first issue was weather, the launch countdown was delayed. Then came this announcement.
Launch Director Charlie Blackwell-Thompson has called a scrub for today.
NASA engineers ran out of time in the launch window. Engineers were nervous at first over a hydrogen spike in a fuel tank. That issue they determined wouldn't be a problem, but then they hit others. One of the 4 engines on the bottom of the core stage of the rocket wasn't cooling properly, and there was an issue with a vent valve on an inner tank. The head of NASA says the Artemis rocket is too complex to take chances.
You don't want to light the candle until it's ready to go.
Now, there was some disappointment in the crowds that gathered in Florida and at the Canadian Space Agency in Quebec. But this scrubbed launch will still give engineers information that they could only get by fueling up and almost launching.
This is good data. Getting this far in the launch sequence allows them to test the system.
This first Artemis launch is a test itself. It won't have astronauts on board, but will make the trip all the way to the moon, about 450,000 kilometers. Every part of the mission will be analyzed, and Artemis 2 will carry humans. In fact, it's supposed to carry a Canadian astronaut. That crew hasn't been selected yet. Artemis 3, planned for 2025, will be the first that sees astronauts again actually land on the lunar surface. But to get to that stage, they have to get Artemis 1 to the moon.
We're learning all along the way. We're trying to do something that hasn't been done in over 50 years.
The next launch window for Artemis 1 is Friday. NASA engineers will meet Tuesday afternoon to decide whether to go later in the week or give themselves more time. Mike Armstrong, Global News, St. Hubert, Quebec.
Let's leave the future aside and go back many millions of years. Researchers in Portugal have released new images of one of Europe's largest prehistoric finds, and it's all thanks to some garden work. These gigantic bones belong to a Brachiosaurus, a huge herbivore that walked the earth around 100 million years ago. It's estimated to have been 25 meters long and would have looked like this. This is the largest dinosaur fossil ever discovered in Europe, and it was originally found in a backyard in 2017, get this, while a man was working on his house. Paleontologists have been carefully unearthing it ever since, and they're still working to uncover the rest of the skeleton. Another relic has also left a massive footprint, in cash that is. A rare baseball card has just smashed the record for the most valuable card ever. This 1952 trading card of Major League Baseball Hall of Famer Mickey Mantle, graded near perfect condition, was auctioned off to a jaw-dropping $12.6 million US on Sunday. The card last changed hands in 1991 when it was sold for $50,000. It also marks the highest price ever paid for any sports collectible. A poignant reminder over the nation's capital. Next, Ottawa's new tribute to residential school survivors. In Ottawa today, Indigenous culture and this country's shameful efforts to eradicate it were in focus as a new symbol was raised over the Capitol. The survivor's flag is dedicated to the countless Indigenous people who endured the agony of residential schools. And it's going to fly over Parliament Hill for the next 2 years before being moved to a permanent home. Karen Lieberman has more.
A symbol of a history once rooted in shame, now rising above Parliament Hill.
It's a reminder that the survivors in this country
are not to be forgotten.
The Prime Minister joining Indigenous Canadians from across the country to raise the survivors' flag, honoring those who were forced into Canada's residential school system.
Take an opportunity to meet us. Know who we are. Don't just talk about us. Don't own us as our survivors.
The orange and white flag was designed by the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Each element, like the children, taken from their families, and the eagle feather, all symbolically significant and carefully selected in consultation with survivors.
You can see that the strength and the commitment in the flag itself, and you can see their hope for the future. The hope that the seeds that rest beneath the soil will someday sprout and bloom again as prophesied by our people.
It says that we acknowledge the intergenerational trauma these so-called schools have caused, and that we commit to continue working together towards a future of healing and partnership.
Last month, a long-awaited public apology on Canadian soil by Pope Francis.
Sorry for the ways in which, regrettably,
for the Church's role in government-funded schools meant to destroy Indigenous culture and language. St. Anne's residential school survivor Evelyn Korkmas met with the Pope and previously traveled to Rome.
And I presented him with an empty box, and I asked him, this is where I want you to put the residential school documents.
More than the symbolic gesture of a flag, Korkmas wants all documents related to residential schools released.
It opens the true history of Canada, not the ones that we were taught in school, but the true history, the real history. And for me, that's the only way that survivors across Canada can find peace.
A reminder of the resilience it took to survive the residential school system for all in Canada's capital to see. Karen Lieberman, Global News.
And that crucial reminder is what we leave you with tonight in Ottawa, with the survivors' flag flying over Parliament Hill. That's Global National for this Monday night. Thanks for spending part of your evening with us. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.